Shana Tova. The Jewish tradition is one of multiple voices, often raised. Think about the creation story in the first chapter of Genesis. It unfolds over 7 days in one chapter. Immediately afterwards, the author of the Garden of Eden story one-ups the first story and demands 2 chapters. Different stories, different authors right up front. They have mutually exclusive details, and they both contain truth. The Mishnah, the earliest layer of exclusively Jewish literature, begins with a question and then offers multiple answers. I love that. When you're not dedicated to finding the one definitive answer, it opens up a world of possibilities. Rabbi David Seidenberg translates Hayom Harat Olam not as today is the world's birthday, but today is pregnant with endless possibilities. Harat Olam means eternally pregnant, kind of a nightmare thought for some, but it's not Hayom Yom Huledet, today is your birthday, it's Hayom Harat Olam, and Olam can be forever, as in Le'olam Va'ed. Today is pregnant with endless possibilities. Geschmack. Let us then begin these high holidays with a debate from the Talmud. As a disclaimer, on the one hand, this Talmudic vignette is totally appropriate for the season, but on the other hand, it's kind of a downer. We have a debate between the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel. No surprise there. Here's the surprise. It's the Shammaites who end up winning this argument. That's unusual. The Hillelites, after 2.5 years of deliberation, conceded. The Talmud doesn't tell us what prompted the dispute. All we know is where we find the dispute in the Talmud. Anybody named Meir in the sanctuary today? Anybody have a relative? Oh, yes, we have a mayor here. Mayor, what does your name mean? Fourth mayor. Fourth, okay, fair enough. So, Rabbi Meir, by the way, is the rabbi who introduced the unique system of Torah readings that we here at AJ use and have used since the time of Rabbi Yaakov Rosenberg. Meir derives from the Hebrew word for light, or, and it means a source of illumination. Why was Rabbi Meir named Meir? Asks the Talmud. Rabbi Meir could convincingly argue that bacon was kosher. I know you like that better than being eternally pregnant. Rabbi Meir could convincingly argue that bacon was kosher and that loving your neighbor was a mortal sin. Rabbi Meir didn't believe those things, but he could argue effectively that they were true. He was called Meir, the Talmud tells us, because he enlightened the eyes of his fellow rabbis about the halakha, about Jewish law. What the Talmud is saying here is that Rabbi Meir pulled back the curtain and shined a light on the fact that there is no necessary connection between being able to successfully argue a point and the truth of that point. That's why he was called Meir. Let me say that a little differently. The Talmud uses Meir as an illustration to show that convincing arguments by themselves are no guarantees of truth. And if a great argument is no guarantee of the truth, a shoddy argument suggests you're not even close. After explaining why Meir is so named, the Talmud introduces our dispute. For 2.5 years, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel argued. The house of Shammai says, it would have been more comfortable for us had we not been created. than to have been created. And the house of Hillel said, it's more comfortable for us that we were created than had we not been created. They voted and determined. It would have been more comfortable for us had we not been created than to have been created. I said it was a downer. So we don't know what prompted their debate. Maybe it was seeing their leadership become corrupted, as the majority of the people felt hopeless and desperate. But we know that argumentation alone was not able to answer the question of whether or not it's more comfortable for us to have been created or not. That's what we learned from Rabbi Meir. And if we're unable to reason our way to an answer about that question, that's uncomfortable for us. And Shammai wins the argument. Life is messy, full of ambiguity, uncertainty, and doubt. It's rarely clear how to navigate this world, even when we are all doing our best to be our best. What our piece of Talmud tells us is that there are really clever people, even judges, like Rabbi Meir, who can offer lots and lots of reasons to do the wrong things. When ambiguity is compounded by misdirection from folks who are trying their best only for themselves, you get discomfort. One of my takeaways from this passage is that comfort is not the highest value in Judaism. Sometimes, and with increasing frequency these days, we need to put ourselves into a place of discomfort to best discern God's will. With practice and goodwill, we'll get more comfortable with being uncomfortable. For those of you with memories like elephants, which is not a partisan reference, you may recall that my first year here, I spoke about why Judaism sides with Hillel and his students and not Shammai. It's not because Hillel was objectively right or smarter or even kinder. Shammai, after all, was the guy who said to greet everyone with a smiling face. We side with Hillel because he taught his own students Shammai's positions. And on a number of occasions, he had an open enough mind to allow himself to be persuaded by Shammai's arguments. Our dispute about whether it's more comfortable to have been created is an example of Hillel's acknowledgement of his own fallibility. He admitted he was wrong. We side with Hillel because he was, in contemporary terms, an engaged fallibilist. It's not that Hillel knew theoretically that he could be wrong, that he was fallible. Every person should know that. It's that Hillel and his disciples tested their ideas against reality and actively considered other approaches. That's the engaged part of engaged fallibilism. And every once in a while, Hillel pat Shammai on the back and said, Yasher koyach, I agree, you're right. Shammai never, not once, did that. Nor did he ever teach the opposing point of view to his students. That's why there's no Shammai house on college campuses. There are Hillel houses because we need to be better at teaching and listening to opposing points of view. Our Talmudic debate isn't whether it was better to have been created or not. It was about whether it would have been more comfortable for us to have not been created. They agreed it would have been, but they didn't just leave it there. They said that since we've been created, let us scrutinize our deeds and determine where we've gone wrong and how best to behave in the future. That's teshuvah. Scrutinizing our deeds is exhausting. We've just undergone 2.5 years of cancellations, postponements, Zoom minions, and mask mandates. to keep our community safe. Because safety, not comfort, is our ultimate value. The Talmud says, Sakanta chamira me'isura. Danger is more serious than a biblical prohibition. In practice, we can't endanger ourselves or others, even if it means violating a Torah prohibition. Safeguarding our lives is our ultimate value. This past year, Professor Ken Stein from Emory came to talk about the history and politics of Palestine and Israel. There were some congregants who were not comfortable with his presentation. With discussions of history, there is evidence, and that evidence sometimes has real-world implications, sometimes life and death implications. It's the role of scholars like Ken Stein to evaluate and analyze the evidence. It's not that he can't be wrong. Scholars disagree all the time. It's that there's no reason to think that any expert is wrong just because what they say makes you uncomfortable. Our comfort and the truth are independent of one another. There's no relationship between what makes anyone uncomfortable and what the truth is. Isolating in your own camp with your own people, reinforcing your own views, without being engaged fallibilists, is what the house of Shammai did. If we want them to be open to changing their minds, then we need to be open to changing ours. And the odds are we're not right about everything. One obvious strategy for dealing with disagreement is to agree to disagree. That shouldn't be so uncomfortable. But here's the problem. You can only do that when what you share is more important or fundamental than what you disagree about. That's why the Hillelites and the Shammaites' children could marry one another. They could agree to disagree because what they shared was more fundamental than what they disagreed about. What we're all after is the best way to implement our values. And when we share those values, or when they largely overlap, maybe we can learn something from approaching the problem differently. The Talmud concludes its discussion of Hillel and Shammai by saying, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. Both Hillel's and Shammai's words are words of the living God. They both contain a truth that is, like the living God, bigger than any single static slice of truth. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. The real challenge is when you're dealing with folks who don't share your fundamental values. For Jews, the first question we should ask is whether the dispute touches upon our safety, our ultimate value. Let me give you a few concrete examples that might not have registered with everyone, given everything else that's going on in our world. In Tennessee, home to a recent spate of anti-Semitic flyers on Nashville doorsteps, the state legislature passed a law permitting religious-based adoption agencies that accept government funding to exclude placement of orphans to folks who don't meet their religious criteria. Initially, the law was criticized as targeting gay adoptions. But when a Jewish couple was denied the possibility of adopting an orphan simply because they were Jewish, they sued. In July of 2022, they lost. The court's majority wrote that the 2020 Tennessee law is lawful because, quote, it does not single out people of the Jewish faith as a disfavored, innately inferior group, end quote. Right. The law just allows state-funded adoption agencies to single out Christians as the only people worthy of adopting orphans. The adoption agency, the Holston United Methodist Home for Children, is using our tax dollars to place orphans in homes that conform with their Christian values. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "To compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical." James Madison, writing about the same issues, said, "Compelling taxpayers to sponsor any religion is itself a signal of persecution." It seems to me that these two founding fathers, Jefferson and Madison, would say that Tennessee Jews are suffering from tyranny and persecution. I won't argue with our country's vote, but I'll use the word discrimination. The specific issue of adoption is not one of life and death, so it doesn't rise to the level of threatening our physical safety, but Jews and Judaism are suffering discrimination because we're not Christians. Americans United for the Separation of Church and State is handling the legal appeal against the Holston United Methodist Home for Children. I found those quotes from Jefferson and Madison in a dissenting opinion from a 2022 U.S. Supreme Court case about Christian schools in Maine receiving taxpayer-funded tuition assistance. The dissenters on the U.S. Supreme Court were quoting Jefferson and Madison because taxes paid by non-Christians are going to fund Christian schools. Jews are entitled to cry foul when public schools are teaching anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, precisely because the schools are funded by the public. But we have no oversight of what's taught in Christian school curricula. Yet non-Christians are funding those curricula. The majority of the Supreme Court tells us that if we Jews want the same taxpayer perks, we can open up our own school and receive tuition assistance too. The problem is that we don't have the numbers to open up our own schools in Maine. This is a textbook case of tyranny of the majority. But again, not necessarily an issue of safety. Alas, our safety has come under threat by another U.S. Supreme Court decision. In many parts of the country, Jews are among those unable to access the full range of female reproductive health services. On one Pennsylvania candidate's website, there's a mistranslated verse from Psalms used to justify that Christian candidate's position on abortion, namely, that life begins at conception. There's nothing wrong with any candidate basing his political position on his personal religious beliefs. The problem is that his version of religion restricts our version of religion. In this instance, his version sometimes threatens the safety of a pregnant woman. In the language of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, his version of religion prohibits the free exercise of our religion. Nothing about the national debate on abortion is comfortable. Giving this sermon is uncomfortable, and I imagine for some of you listening to this sermon is uncomfortable. But we all need to get less uncomfortable, or at least more accustomed, with being discomforted. Our rights and our safety depend on us acting. The Capitol of the United States is the symbol of our national rights. There was a discussion in the 1980s about whether the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum should be built in Washington, D.C., right off the Capitol Mall. The Shoah, after all, was a catastrophe on European soil. Yad Vashem was built in Jerusalem to demonstrate what can happen to Jewish people without a Jewish state. That logic is obvious. But why should the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum be built here in D.C.? Ultimately, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum was built to demonstrate what can happen to individuals whose rights are not protected by the government and by the law. Although at the time, I was sympathetic to the arguments against building the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, I've seen how powerfully and effectively the museum delivers its message about the protection of individual rights, a fundamental American value. Like Hillel, I admitted I was wrong. Sakanta chamira mi'isura. Protecting ourselves from danger is more important than violating a biblical prohibition. Safeguarding our lives is an ultimate value. Some people are single-issue voters. Were I to be a single-issue voter, this would be my single issue. Is this candidate privileging Christianity and those political positions advocated by a relatively small group's interpretation of Christianity? If so, I wouldn't vote for the candidate. Period. Full stop. The specific cases of adoption, abortion, and schooling do not disturb everyone equally. However important those issues are, they're less important to me than the principle of our Constitution's equal protection of individual rights, which includes the freedom to be Jewish without suffering discrimination. Those three cases were all decided in the past 6 months. Relatively speaking, America has been good for the Jews, but the status of Jews in Judaism is being eroded in this country. That's deeply uncomfortable, and it's dangerous. One of the best ways we can all defend our rights is to get out the vote. To that end, our Social Justice Committee, AJ Acts, will be coordinating 4 actions: voter registration, helping people acquire absentee ballots if they desire, helping people identify their polling stations, and when necessary, driving people to the polls. We're asking you to volunteer. Later this week, we'll be sending out an email to the congregation requesting your help. In many matters, we can agree to disagree, and we can disagree without being disagreeable. But when we're denied the rights guaranteed to us, rights enshrined in our nation's founding documents, rights designed to protect us from the tyranny of the majority, et la'asot la'Adonai. It's time to act for God. We're not waiting for the storm to pass. We've seen that movie. We will suffer discomfort to avoid suffering discrimination. We will defend the rights and lives of others, not just because it's tactical to form alliances, but because justice is what we pursue. We will protest treating human beings like chattel because we are descendants of enslaved people in Egypt who keep alive the memory of that experience in order to overcome our discomfort, challenging unjust laws. We will protect the alien, the widow, and the orphan, the world's most vulnerable, because we belong to a tradition that demands we do only justice and acts of loving kindness and walk modestly with our God. How can we sit here today and pray to a God of justice and not be just? How can we sit here today and pray to a God of compassion and not show compassion? How can we sit here today and pray to a God of forgiveness and not forgive? Those are the deeds that move us closer to the Messianic days where we will merit our names being written in the book of life. L'shana tova techatevu v'techatemu.